Good luck, Gregg.
I appreciate it. Hey, everybody. Welcome to ManageIQ's Sprint 73 review. I think it's been 2 weeks since our last confession.
I'm going to give you your pen. No, that's right.
Next slide.
Restart the recording.
Maybe you should. No, I'm kidding. So
Stop
today,
recording and start over.
I think so. Today, sprint statistics. I'm going to be covering that for Oleg. He's over in Tel Aviv this week, and we're going to hear from Carol talking about community updates. Harpreet will cover classic UI. Looks like for service UI, we just had bug fixes. For providers, Dan, Adam, and Rich will give us an update. In Automate, Drew will help us out, and then Platform, GT. And for API, we'll hear from Alberto. And then our bud, Chris, will talk about documentation. We'll have a little discussion at the end. Next slide. All right, so 595 PRs merged across our 86 repos. This is a little bit down from last week or from last review. The majority of these look like they're in quote other repos, and then also UI and integration tests. Nice. Next slide. So yeah, as I was saying, we dropped a little bit, but this is pretty standard when we get into a stabilization sprint like we're in right now. This has been the first sprint of stabilizing the here we go, Gaprindishvili release. And it's been quite a lot of bug fixes. I think we can jump to the next slide and see that as well. Yeah, so this sprint has been mostly bug fixes and documentation, which is actually really good for a stabilization sprint. There's still some enhancements coming in. Some of that stuff that is for post Gaprindishvili, and some of that is features that are still kind of trickling in after we started the stabilization sprint. So we're trying to shore that up and get mostly just over to bug fixes. Next slide. So the repository health report. So if you look through this, there's a lot of negligible changes, except for the UI Classic had a drop in coverage. 15%. I looked at the last sprint review slides just a second ago, and they were up to 64. So we'll probably have to take a look at what happened there. I don't know if that's a reporting thing or if that's actually dropping 15% in coverage. It would be pretty surprising to drop 15% in one sprint, but it could happen, I suppose, if a lot of code was added. So we'll take a look at that and see what's going on there. Next slide. I think we're handing over to Carol to talk about community.
Hi, thanks, Greg. So for the community update, I hope most of you know and have voted already for the next release name. If not, please go to talk.manageiq.org. Voting is open till Friday, and even though it's quite obvious, one of the possible winners, but you never know until the last minute. So cast your vote if you haven't already. And then we have our regular last week in ManageIQ posts, regularly entertaining as well. Please check them out by Roman and Drew these 2 weeks. Then there are several website issues reported on GitHub, and John and I fixed a couple of them, mainly updating them to reflect the latest information with latest screenshots, and also for Red Hat virtualization, we have like new images available, so we added them to the download page. And finally, for event, I've submitted requests for 2 upcoming events in, I think, late January and early February next year. DevConf in Brno, Czech Republic, and FOSDEM in Brussels, Belgium. The call for papers are also open for these 2 events. So if you're interested, please take a look. The one for DevConf is already closing pretty soon, also this week, Friday. And the ones for FOSDEM developer rooms are varied depending on the different dev rooms, some as close as tomorrow and others to mid-December. So take a look at those dev rooms if you're interested and submit proposals for them. That's all from me. And next slide, please. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. So in classic UI repo, as you can see, total of 111 PRs were merged. This sprint was more focused on fixing bugs, as you can tell by the amount of bug PRs that were merged. So we had about 73 bugs PRs merged, 11 enhancements, and 2 each of technical debt and refactoring. And there were some UI component related PRs merged, 5 PRs there. As you can see, we squeezed in some enhancements that were on the verge of being merged during cutoff for the last sprint. There were several bugs fixed. Various GTL and paging related bugs were fixed during the sprint. I would say those were introduced during our refactoring efforts in list views areas and paginations and form button controls. So some of the screens had like double buttons showing up, or paging controls were showing up where they shouldn't be visible. And some of the forms screens had lost form buttons completely. So that was fixed during the sprint. And also the context menu drill down links were fixed on the performance charts. And for the enhancements, custom buttons CRUD was added for generic object definitions. I have a screenshot for that, and I'll explain that when I show the screenshot. Expose of custom buttons for generic objects in services area was added. And then some custom button support was added for some missing classes such as container nodes, users, groups, and tenants. Lenovo xClarity administrator remote console support was added for Lenovo providers. And also the support to manage policies for middleware servers was added. So you should be able to see the manage policies button on the middleware servers list views and summary screens. There was also support was added for VMRC console credentials for VMware infra providers. Next screen, please. So you can see here during last sprint, CRUD support and the tree support was added for custom button groups in the generic objects area. In this sprint, we added the support to be able to add, edit, delete, update custom buttons for the generic objects. So you can see on the left, there's a new actions folder node. Under that, you can see button group, and under that, there are some buttons, and you can add buttons right under the actions folder itself. Next screen, please. So this is the generic objects instance summary screen, where you can see the specific buttons for each instance, and you can execute them from there or from the list view when drilling to generic object instances from a service summary screen. Next screen, please. And that's the VMR. I'm sorry, that's a Lenovo provider summary screen, and the management console button was added to that screen. Next screen, please. Oh, that's all I have for the UI. Thanks.
This is Dan B. I'll be filling in for Brona today. I'll be talking a little bit about the cloud side. Adam's going to talk about infra, and Rich is going to do SmartState. Here we have the providers that made it to the playoffs this year. So get your brackets in. I think Hawkular could go all the way. Next slide, please. These are the PRS for all that were merged for all the providers. Top three being Overt, Kubernetes, and Azure. Next slide, please. So for Azure, we had an issue where disk space and disk free space were wrong. They were showing 0, when in fact we weren't actually collecting that information. That has been fixed. In addition, we're setting the disk tier so standard or premium storage, which the customers can use for chargeback. It was a little complicated for unmanaged storage because it requires an additional 2 requests per account, which slowed down the parser. So we added a setting. Users can enable or disable that if they want, so that it doesn't slow down their refresh. As for Amazon, I was going to see if Lattice could speak to that point. Lattice, are you there by any chance? I'm afraid I don't know much about. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, so just batch saving. So we do batch SQL queries instead of like one query per one record for Amazon inventory now. So that's only in master, and that's it.
Thanks. Next slide, please. And I will turn this over to Adam.
All right, thanks, Dan. So this sprint for SCVMM, you can now provision a VM to a VM network or a VM subnet. Most of the code to do this was in the previous sprint, but now it's been enhanced to actually work. So with 100% more success now. For Rev, we are now reconnecting VMs to events that were caught before the VM was actually in the database. So this happens a lot when you get an event that says the VM was created, but we haven't done the first refresh yet. We actually go back and reconnect VMs to those events that contain that VM. That wasn't happening on Rev, and now it is. And along with a lot of other providers, we fixed credential validation for Rev in this sprint. For OpenStack, there's a validation that a template has to have a name that's not blank. When we added Cloud Volume templates to OpenStack, that wasn't being checked and filled in with the ID. So now that's fixed on OpenStack for Cloud Volume templates. Next slide.
Just 1 second, let me just mute somebody who's not muted.
Someone's getting the mute hammer.
I got it. Okay. 1 second. Get back. Okay.
There we go. And for middleware, there were some issues getting live metrics, so that was resolved, as well as now control and compliance policies are added for middleware servers. And that's it. Over to Rich.
So this sprint, we spent some time cleaning up after the deliveries we made in the previous sprints. Most of the fixes center around Azure and Amazon. In Azure, we discovered that snapshot names have an 80-character limit, which we weren't really checking for. So we had to implement a fix for that. And there was a change to the backend API where resource groups were being returned as objects, where in the past they were strings, and we had to fix that as well. In the newly delivered Amazon SmartState, we're tying up some loose ends there. We added UI changes so users could enter Docker credentials for the provider. And now that tab will only be visible when it's needed. Like upstream, it's not needed, and it's only needed when there's a flag set that says credentials are needed, and that's a configurable thing. And we have that in the productization YAML file. So users who don't need to enter that won't need to see that tab. When the tab is visible, there was a bug where even if you didn't click on the tab, or or enter any credentials, it would not enable the add button for the provider, even if the Docker credentials were optional. That we fixed that. In a related bug, there was a red exclamation point on the tab, even if you didn't attempt to enter them or validate them, and that's now done as well. And that's pretty much it. Next slide.
Yeah, this was for Automate. For this sprint, we actually had 16 PRs merged, 9 enhancements, 6 bugs, and 1 technical debt. I'll cover the enhancements next, starting with custom buttons, although I've been told they've been renamed to custom buttons because all the work Tim's been doing on them. Eric, basically, it was kind of a first pass, but we've got custom buttons put on services, VMs, and generic objects now go through the shared dialog runner, where the plan is to share all our dialog code between shared services and direct provisioning, and this was just a start. And then Drew, you also, along those lines, kind of via updated 25 models with custom actions mix in, which will allow us to support custom buttons to the API. And with the refactor of the mix in, it allows us to actually extend each model, with custom buttons as we see fit. Over in an embedded Ansible, Bill and Madhu got us our features for this sprint. Bill added a log output option for embedded Ansible service. So now when a playbook runs, you'll either have a default, it will log on error, or you can have it log everything always, or have it never log. And then Madhu added a task href slug as an extra var for Ansible playbooks. And I'm just going to read what he put in the PR to make sure I get exactly how it all works. But it allows a playbook to access the request task so that we can update provisioning options from the playbook. And since the request task doesn't have RBAC, the only way to edit the task is as a sub-collection of the request, which does have RBAC. Next slide, please. On services, our fearless leader GM had some time to take apart from wrangling all of us to actually get us a nice feature out, and he basically pulled out or removed the ability to set service name and description from the dialog fields to basically have support for that in the back end. Normally that's only been handled through the catalog item initialize entry point, and we have certain service provisioning state machines that don't use that entry point. And well, like one of those is Ansible Playbook Services. So now the back end can actually set these fields, and it also sets up a pattern so that we can extend this out later. For example, setting retirement date. The nice thing is the logic runs before the entry point, and so it's backwards compatible with everything else that's out there. And that's it for me. GT is next.
All right, thanks, Drew. So on the platform side, you could see it was a bug fix sprint for sure, 19 bugs fixed and only 3 enhancements. So not too much to talk about on the enhancement side, but I will use the opportunity to kind of go through some of the Chargio. That's the new chargeback back end. I had mentioned last sprint that we started doing integration with it, and the goal is to switch over to it completely over time. So I'll go through like what the benefits are that we'll get from that. But on the performance side, LJ had a nice find. He made a change to only ask for the PID for the connection, the SPID, the database connection, only when we do a timeout on a queue message instead of on each message, and that saves a lot of back and forth to the database. And this is in progress for chargeback, but Libor is actually writing a blog to kind of go through the new features for the G release for chargeback, and that'll also include how things are calculated, because that comes up all the time. People don't really understand how calculations are made in chargeback, and think they're wrong, or don't set up the rates right. So hopefully that'll help. All right, next slide, please. So I'll go through these pretty quick. I don't want to spend too much time on this. So these are all future-facing benefits. None of this stuff is in now. We just did the initial integration where we're using the back end to do the cost calculations for existing chargeback, and that has to be enabled by a flag in settings. So ultimately, we'll get pretty much instant report generation because in the new back end, the data that feeds the reports are actually compiled and saved in the database over the reporting period. So running a report is really just taking the data straight from there and putting it on the report. I mean, the goal with the new chargeback is reporting obviously is one thing, but also being able to feed like external financial systems as well. So we kind of need to have the compiled data in a form to be able to do that. We'll be able to generate reports at the user group and or tenant level. We can't do today, and something that has been asked for. And it'll allow for automatic creation of reports for new users when they are added to the system or added to groups, which is definitely something we can't do today as well. You'd have to create a separate report with filtering by user in the existing chargeback. We have tiered rating today, but this will let us do some enhancements to that. So we will ultimately be able to do multiple tiers in the calculation. So we call this blended or unblended tiers, thanks to LJ for explaining that. It's basically when you, like today we figure out what tier the usage falls in and use that rate for all the usage. The blended would be where you apply the rate for each tier, the amount that falls into each tier. So we'll be able to do that in the future. And also using any input parameter for tier selection will be possible. The rating is going to be extremely flexible because you can rate on things other than metrics. Pretty much anything that's in the database for resource that's being included on chargeback, you can add a rate for. And actually, that was the next bullet. Okay, next slide, please. And then is a cleaner API, so we'll be able to generate like rating quotes. And what I mean by that is being able to, like when you're editing rates, we will be able to actually show like what the outcome is of that rate, based on some sample data, something you can't do now either. We'll have real currency management and conversions. Everything's done with integers, so that we won't have rounding differences. Also, because we'll be storing the data that builds the reports in tables in the database, it'll allow for comparisons like month over month, quarter to quarter, year over year, because all that stuff will be there, as long as it's not purged. And it's only the stuff that's needed for the chargeback reports, no more, no less. And then we'll be able to integrate with external financial systems, which is one of the future requirements. And also, it's basis for more enhancements, like being able to do discounts and budgeting as well. Next slide. So I give credit to Sergio for these diagrams. I'm not going to go through this in detail. I'll stay real high level. This just illustrates what some of these data structures that are used in the calculation of the chargeback. Like right now, if you look on the top there, you have C&U, and that basically when we do chargeback today, C&U just feeds the report. Now we have some other things in place. There's that thing that says roll up. Those are data roll ups, it's the C&U data for just the things we need on chargeback, along with some other context information about the resources that we're charging for. And then that gets into a data view that pulls in the price plan and costing information for the reporting period that we're running for, the billing cycle. And then those get rolled up into an envelope, and that's what we report off of. And you can see on the bottom there that kind of have the price plan, the roll up, and the resource all meeting to the envelope. Next slide, please. And this just shows you what's in the price plan and some of the things, like the way it's broken down. You can see like the input measure it's very similar to how we rate today, but those things can be added. So you can add any of these input measures, and it just breaks down to like an entity, like a VM, a group, which would be like CPU, and then a specific field in the CPU group. So we can add any of those things. Going to need all kinds of UX for this stuff. That all has to be worked out. And also like how we do the build the data rollups and data views and all that stuff over the reporting cycle also needs to be worked out. I mean, all the backend code to do it is there, but coordinating that with the current rollups, which is a performance heavy hitter right now, needs to be done carefully. All right, next slide. And by the way, if anyone has questions about this, ping me or Sergio.
Greg, just to clarify, the old chargeback system has been reorganized to use the new chargeback system, correct?
It has, but not by default. So there's a setting to turn that on. So it's really just like a prototype.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, and then some bug fixes. So Chris A made a fix that corrected a bug where you couldn't create a new zone. Chargeback fix by Libor. We had kind of dropped some custom attributes selection in chargeback report selection with some of the recent enhancements, and he fixed that. Joe V fixed a bug where after successfully logging in, you'd get a 400 error. And then a replication fix where this is the first time this has happened, but like you could actually end up subscribing to a region that's the same as the global region. You could like subscribe to your own region. And one of the side effects of subscribing to a region is we want to clean out all the data for that region that you're subscribing to first before we start replicating so that it's clean. So you can kind of just use your imagination and what could happen there. So we put a change in there to prevent you subscribing to the same region. Fix to high availability where the failover monitor wasn't being started, which is kind of important because then we wouldn't fail over when there was when a database when the master database went down. Also, this was in the appliance console recovering from a crash when setting the appliance as HA primary node, and there's no region, so it would actually crash the appliance console. And then fix was made also to the appliance console where the secondary DNS was getting lost when the network was configured. And I think that's it for the platform. Yeah, Alberto?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So the API team has been very busy fixing bugs this sprint, like all other teams. But we did manage to get a couple of enhancements in. So the first one by Andy DV, adding support for cloud templates. So we have a new collection, cloud templates, and it's also exposed as a sub-collection to providers. So we have the regular gets of the collection, the resource of it, as well as the collection of providers, and an individual one, sub-resource of the provider. And also we support the bulk action query for the cloud. Next slide, please. Okay, we have an enhancement by Madhu. So by default, the API does not return encrypted fields. Anything that's model-defined, for example, from the password mixin, those are not returned. But for the automate workspace, the encrypted fields there, they're not model-defined, they're defined by the user, and they need to be returned by default mask, of course, for the API clients. And that kind of shows you here a little bit how that's done. So we have the different attributes, the fields, and the objects and method parameters, and you'll see the encrypted fields have the password colon storage as a mask. And that's it for the API. Next slide.
Hi, for documentation in this last sprint, we had 19 PRs merged, 11 of which were bugs, 8 of which were enhancements. Highlights among those are we've updated wording around the OSP tenant mapping, corrected TP notice for ServiceNow, updated cloud forms on Azure Doc for the modified CFME Azure image, and we've added some drag and drop service dialog designer instructions. Next slide, please.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for all these updates. Any questions, comments, tomatoes?
Tomatoes.
I don't see anything.
All right. Sounds like not. Well, we'll be back in 2 weeks and with another update.